Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 25th of October 2015. Most folk today really can't read books, unfortunately. And many studies have been done. I've gone through them in the past and read them and put them in the archive section at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, where MIT and others have studied the human mind is ad infinitum. What they haven't studied really is nothing. They've studied everything about us as human creatures, you see. Habits, traits, and how we can get programmed, peer pressure, and how it works on us, and how to use and utilize it, etc., for consensus building and opinion making and everything else. And behavior modification on a mass scale, of course. All scientifically done by your tax money working against you. And the tax money goes to employ all these different professors and so on to do all the different studies and write it up for their masters. And it's interesting to find out how everything today, like yesterday, really is run by the same families and dynasties. We see it, of course, in Britain. It was expected in Britain for a long time that the sons of politicians would go into politics. Now it's the sons and daughters, of course, going into politics, and same with the House of Lords, etc. They were all, when you got your period, you were expected to take over from your daddy, and nothing's really changed, because now with the total consolidation of all media and mainstream across the world, pretty well, you have the same news given across the planet to every different outlet, to make sure we all get the same standardized news. So opinion is standardized too, and documentation is standardized as to what you're going to be told and what you're going to end up believing as well. But Peter Wright, who worked for MI5 for a long time, who wrote a couple of books actually, one was called Spycatcher, and he mentioned, he was a head of MI5, that he was employed by quite easily passed too for his entrance and so on, because his daddy, of course, was a long-time high-ranking guy in the Navy at one point, attached to with intelligence, and he got into it himself through the same method. He said that they prefer, in all government circles, to employ family members into the civil service and so on, and different agencies too, because they've all been well vetted. They know who the wives are. It's very important, of course, to have the right kind of wife as well. And they know what kind of doctrine is going to be taught at home to the children, how they're going to get brought up with certain values that are authorized and so on. And they walk straight in, basically, to the civil service jobs. And in politics, of course, we have the same thing still today, where through, again, the big, you might say the big celebrity creating machinery that worked with film stars to make them stars. Before you heard the term stars, were just actors and actresses and other stars. And they're made stars simply by the propaganda machine behind it. And same with musicians, pop stars and all the rest of it, and rock stars. Same kind of thing goes on today. It's the same thing with politics. Same machinery, same techniques are used to bring someone into the limelight and give them a fake persona which is sold to the public until the public think they actually know the person, and they'll go and vote for them because they're told to, in many different ways and prompts and all the rest of it, which they don't think through themselves. They don't know what's working on them. They just say, I like that person, and I'll vote for that person. And we have the dynasties going on too, from the very top, the supra-political system that runs the world, into the political system, of course, by the ones who all work on the same agenda. There are no parties as far as I'm concerned. I've watched since I was a little child how the left wing are always brought in at a certain time to push policies to internationalize things, and more apparent years ago, in fact, but it's still the same today. And when you were fed up getting taxed to death and all the rest of it, they'd bring in the right-wing parties who would pretend to be more nationalistic and take care of your interests, you see. But all the treaties they signed with the United Nations and all the different organizations under the umbrella of the United Nations never changed. No one came in and says, oh, well, we're tossing this out the window, even though you signed it. We'll tear it up. It's not good for the country. No one's ever done it, left wing, right wing. It just doesn't happen. Which tells you there's really a super manager here above all other governments, and including your own. Because obviously, if you really truly had different goals, you would have, for the nation, you would have parties that claim to be one way or another. You'd have them coming in and saying this is good or bad, and we're tearing it up because it's not good for our particular party's stance. It doesn't happen. They abide by them as though they're somehow written in stone and brought down from the hill by Moses. So we're living through an agenda. I've mentioned this so many times. You're living through a script, really. I've gone through the United Nations strategy, but with all of its just different agendas and their time limits they put on things, 5-year plans, 10, 50, 100-year plans, and so on. And you're living through them. And it gets awfully boring when you realize what's coming up way, way ahead, years before the general public really get a whiff of what's going on. Most of the public, of course, can't get a whiff because they're too busy working and struggling through their ordinary lives. Folk under 30 have been well catered to really be distracted with the promotion of hypersexualization and everything, which keeps them as a child for much, much longer, you might say. And they're not really interested so much in what's going on and what's going to affect them. And they're catered to with all the entertainment galore on sexual themes, where it's music or anything else now. It's all the same kind of thing, movie industry, etc. So you have people getting, you're taught by many, many means to stay out of even being locally active in your little area. The ones who do go out in the local area are generally organized by the globalists under non-governmental organization status, and they go out and they're well organized, well run by the United Nations and the overseers that even the United Nations is under, and they do all their organizing. But the general public don't know anything. Jacques Ellul said it, the philosopher, that most folk learn by osmosis, and by that he meant that bits and bytes really of information kind of filter through them as they go through their daily work. They catch little phrases, bits of phrases here and there, and it forms their opinion. It works on them without them even knowing it's working on them, and even brings them to their conclusions and opinions on things. They become politically correct, even if they don't follow the news very much, because they don't consciously think through things. But all the little prompts and so on, and the psychological warfare techniques that's used on them work awfully, awfully, awfully well. Very, very, very better than any guided missile. The whole idea of managing the general population, the so-called working class types, called the Proles by George Orwell, from the Proletariat, basically. He mentioned in his book 1984, that was published in 1948. And although the original title of the book that he wanted was The Last Man, meaning the last sentient human being who tried to put the little bits that he knew into action in a very, very small scale and suffered the consequences. The idea being, as O'Brien, who tortures him, says in the story, he says, if you were a man, Winston, then you're the last man. The idea that through scientific techniques and mass data collection and so on every single individual, constantly, they would know who would be a problem before it even became a problem, and they deal with it. That's pretty well where we are today, isn't it? And there's a little bit of a spat between Orwell and Aldous Huxley. Huxley, long before, in the 1930s, 1933 I think it was, came up with Brave New World, where he had less of a totalitarian system being overt. It used more covert means to manipulate the people who were already genetically modified into the division of labor from the very top, who were alphas and so alpha pluses and all that, right down to the bottom level of the workers. So they're designed for the particular work they'd have to do. That's not far-fetched at all, because that's where we're going. The spat between Orwell and Huxley was really that Orwell was shaped by the big totalitarian movements of his day, the overtly totalitarian movements like the communist or Bolshevik revolution, which turned into the Soviet system, communism, where democracy was abolished altogether, although they often call themselves the free and democratic state of so-and-so and so-and-so. There was no real democracy there. It was run by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which meant you had a dictator on top of you rather than off the people. It was a dictatorship over the people. And of course, the 1920s and 30s into the 40s were full of that kind of stuff. The whole idea that the elite were on board with totalitarianism, and the supposed opposition of the elite, which is to work together in tandem with Hegelian dialectic to get the same goals achieved. The technique was to use revolution and running the takeover and put experts in to run the world properly. That's never gone away. Today it's dressed up in business suits. It's given fancy titles with United Nations, things like that. But it's still as strong today as it ever was. People can't recognize it simply because they don't wear the uniforms when you come on television as your prime minister or your president. You don't see yourselves or think of yourselves as being brainwashed because it's constantly drummed into you. You live in a free society. And yet you've been through the indoctrination process of the social engineering through the school system, which teaches you about special categories of people and which ones are higher than other ones. And you have to be a new minority to get special status, you see. Which is rather good for the opportunist, because he or she will realize that they get priority hiring down the road if you simply join the right band, you see, and declare you're this or that or whatever it happens to be trendy at the time. So there are many different facets to all of this, but getting back to the system, again, the system is totalitarian, and it's a much more easygoing totalitarianism. We think, of course, we think so, because you don't see the henchmen coming in Brave New World or even in George Orwell's 1984. You don't see them coming smashing your door down, except maybe in the States sometimes under the guise of drug raids and so on. But you don't see them coming into your house because you've said something wrong. That's maybe happening now, actually, with all the politically correct people around there and all the mandates of what you can say and what you can't say, what you can think and what you can't think. Because now it's going down to forbidding you to think about things. Who knows where it might lead, eh? A thought could lead you off to who knows where, eh? Upset the apple cart. So that's where you are today with all of this. But it's going somewhere, of course, and this talk is going somewhere. Because Orwell and Huxley tie in to this too. So does Peter Wright with his intergenerational employing, or employees, you might say, of family dynasties. You never see our ads going in the papers, the general papers for top bureaucrat wanted for the government, or it doesn't happen that way. They do have their in-house ones for already established members to participate or compete to an extent. And even then it depends on who you know and who daddy or mummy is or things like that, you see. So we really are, and I really believe this, we are the modern serfs. That's what we are. We're still modern serfs, or proles. Make no bones about it, we are the proles, and as I always said, the proles don't count. The proles are the silent majority of people who are too busy scurrying and worrying and maybe carrying on 2 or 3 part-time jobs to try and just scrape by. And sometimes you get couples now doing the same thing and trying to raise a child if they've gone that far. A lot of folk today don't bother with the children because they've followed the examples and so on, and all the prompts and indoctrination they were given in their early indoctrination years, that children are economically expensive and can hold you back. Isn't that the whole thing? They can hold you back from, well, by the time they get established, it's like idiocracy, the beginning of idiocracy. Eventually, they're either over the hill, or they're divorced, or the hubby or the wife has died, and it's too late to have a child at all. And they're following all the examples indoctrinated into them by the established order. Charles Galton Darwin, in his book The Next Million Years, talked about ways to discourage folk from having children. He was meaning the wrong kind of people having children. But he said materialism, this basic materialism, can be used and promoted through constant advertising and so on. Would you rather have a car or have a couple of these children, you see? And there's a shiny car done in its usual beautiful marketed way on a TV screen or whatever it happens to be, or a magazine. And so appealing, isn't it? And they sell you this idea of freedom. You buy the car and you got freedom, and you're the only person in the road. They sell you the fantasy. Well, good luck and find a place today where there's no other cars on the road. Although that'll come down in the future with Agenda 21, when private vehicles will be outlawed. You see. So anyway, back again to intergenerationalism. I'm just going to touch on, again, this beautiful system of how you get fed up. That's what democracy is to the general public. You get fed up with the bunches in power now because of all the wrong things that you know has affected you and your finances and everything else, or your job outlook, and you vote the next bunch in. So you're really simply voting the last bunch out, you see. And when they want the Conservatives, as I say, to come in, it's because they want to privatize everything again. Well, in the old days, not now though, the old days, the left wing would always nationalize something and get your tax money to make all the big infrastructure work. The train services, everything was nationalized in Britain and parts of Europe and so on. And then, of course, once they've been nationalized, and the tax money is going into repairing all the railroad lines and getting new equipment and new engines and all the rest of it, then they play the trick of when the next bunch come in, they privatize it again, and you've paid for all the upgrading to it, and they get it for peanuts. It's a con. Democracy is a con. It's well worked out this way. Well, in Canada, of course, you've noticed that Justin Trudeau, the son of Pierre Trudeau, has been elected in as Prime Minister. And that's not by chance either at this time, you see. Because we're coming up in December to the signing of the big, this has been years and years in the works, the final signing of the climate treaty with its carbon taxes, cap and trade, energy taxes, and right down to a tribunal. Just like the World Trade Organization's got this private secret court that fines nations for not complying for certain things and so on. Well, we don't even know who the judges are in the WTO. It'll be the same with this one too. But when they fine nations, that means you're the taxpayer that funds it, it pays it all. And most folk are being taught, lulled into sleep, well, it won't really affect you that much. It's for big businesses. No, it's not, folks. It's for you. It's for all of you. This is to change your entire way of living and to give the go-ahead for the legalization of the experts to come out openly saying we're running your whole lives. Obey, obey, obey. With all the different government agencies coupled with all the international agencies, the United Nations. So this will be the signing into it by Canada and other countries. And once you're into it, folks, they're never going to get out of it. Once it's all in the books, it's legal now to be run under this global governmental system openly, every facet of your lives. They'll expand the laws, just like they always do. They put a law in the books and umpteen laws, then they expand them to include until it's all pervasive. And that's what it's all about. I'll give you an example of what the right wing does to show you, and the type of article they put out on, say, the Prime Minister Harper, who's to be overtaken by Justin Trudeau. And listen to the slant of this article, for instance. This article says, why Justin Trudeau's election is good news for their fight against climate change. And you can't criticize this whole idea that it's all our fault that we've got climate at all. But anyway, it says Trudeau's predecessor, Stephen Harper, was a climate change skeptic, but the new Prime Minister brings a different attitude. So there's your opinion right off the bat, you see, by this reporter. And it says, for years, climate change activists have criticised the Canadian government as a global warming laggard. The Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who has been in power since 2006, has never taken climate change seriously. And that's what Conservatives are supposed to do, you see. Not take it seriously, because it's, as you know, it's all a con for another agenda. When Canada failed to meet carbon cuts set in the Kyoto Protocol, a treaty Canada signed and ratified under a previous government, Harper simply withdrew his country. He just ignored it. But the surprise election of Justin Trudeau yesterday promises to change the perception. The Liberal Party leader emphasised the very real danger of climate change and pledged his support for what he called a pan-Canadian approach to the issue, an international approach. In 2015, pretending that we have to choose between the economy and the environment is as harmful as it is wrong, he said in a speech earlier this year. Even with a resounding win, however, it may provide surprisingly difficult for new Prime Minister Trudeau to enact strong environmental and energy policy at the federal level in Canada. Control over Canadian environmental and energy policy rests largely with the country's powerful provincial leaders. And that's misleading too. It says, indeed, the country explicitly leaves authority over natural resource management to the provinces. And many Canadians still recall an ill-fated attempt in the 1980s by the federal government to grab a larger share of the profits from energy resources in individual provinces. That program was championed by none other than then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father. Again, dynasties again, you see. And it's not, again, too, it's a whole other story how they got Pierre Trudeau in to governments. In fact, it's rather amazing the cons that can be pulled on the whole population. But it takes complicity between all media to make it happen. As his provinces have enormous authority in so many areas, and there are huge regional differences on this issue, said Barry Raby, professor of public policy at the University of Michigan. Canadians have struggled mightily to put together a federal policy that addresses emissions. Well, I've never heard Canadians have been asked to put anything together myself, because the pros don't count, you see. And it says, for these reasons, Trudeau appears keen on implementing a carbon pricing scheme, that's your cap and trade and all that would set targets for emission reductions at the federal level and allow for provinces to design programs independently to meet those goals. Now, shortly, folks, with this final Paris Treaty that will be signed in December, you wait and see as you ramp it all up. And if you think you're paying a lot now for energy and all the rest of it, wait till you see when they're finished with this, because they're going to bring you into utter austerity. That's part of the goals. I've said for years that austerity means that you're spending money, you're left over at the end of the month, if you've got any at all. It's all going to go to essential bills, maybe even penalties and so on. This is the program, which still needs to be fleshed out, may bear some similarity to the President Barack Obama's Clean Power Plan, said Raby, which sets emission reduction standards for each state based on its current energy sources. Now, we're living in one of the coldest climates in the world here, in this part of Canada where I'm living. And I'm telling you, it won't be, lots of folk will start moving. Again, too, they can make everything happen without forcing you off by an order. They can make you just start drifting away from northern areas or rural areas and so on, because you won't be able to afford to live there anymore. Because everything that keeps you warm is based on carbon, even the electric, because it's still something burning somewhere to make it happen. If not, it's nuclear power. And if it's nuclear power, believe you me, that's going down the tubes eventually as well, because once you've got your nothing but nuclear power, they're going to start reducing the outputs to the different people and giving you even rationing down the road. That's all in the books, you wait and see. Now the provinces have already, everything's always done way in advance of what they tell you at the time. The provinces in Canada already were ordered by the federal government a few months back to come up with their own recommendations for the different provinces of what they're going to put into effect when this thing is just signed. The signing is a formality. One in December in Paris, on carbon and so on, climate change, and it's all your fault. And you only pay, believe you me. And it's just a redistribution of wealth by taking your cash and putting it into third world countries so that they can basically have international corporations then set up for free. You pay for all their factories in third world countries. That's really what it's all about. Anyway, it says here that stronger climate action from Canada won't stop global warming on its own. We've had the coldest winters for years, the last few years. The country emits only 2% of the world's carbon emissions from the consumption of energy, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists. Oh, they've got a Union of Concerned Scientists, all on the take, of course. And of course, there's nothing political in it. No, there never is with the scientists. My God, science has always been political, folks. Who think funds them all? It says, though it has one of the highest per capita rates in the world, but experts say the defeat of a high-profile climate skeptic like Harper plays an important role in the global debate over climate change. In other words, they brought out Justin Trudeau, who was riding the old superstar status that was created for his dad to get in the first place. And he's riding the coattails of Dad. And the memory is still there with a lot of Canadians. And so they go and vote for someone. And because Daddy was a superstar, even though he left the country in an awful mess and massive debt. His dad, too, was head of the Canadian Comintern Communist International Group and led it to the delegation from Canada to the Soviet Union, Moscow, it was 1952. When he ran for election, his dad, is Pierre Trudeau, I don't think one paper mentioned that, which tells you it's all rigged. Everything's always rigged. For left-wing and right-wing, you understand, it's always been the same agenda. The whole left and right-wing paradigm is for your consumption, so that you think you're going to get a change. You don't have revolutions every few years. You have votes, you see, and it stops revolutions and things like that. And it works awfully well. You vote the last lot out, you get the next bunch in. And now it's time, of course, to be international. So, in comes Justin Trudeau. So anyway, where's this all going? Well, let's go back again to George Orwell, shall we? And Orwell wrote a letter, I should say, to Noel Wilmot in 1944. He says, many thanks for your letter. You ask whether totalitarianism, leader worship, etc. And that's what totalitarianism is. I don't care if it's been put across by the big superstar creating mechanism and machinery for politicians that wear business suits or even casuals. And that's how they brought his dad out, Trudeau's dad, at one time with his big wide-brimmed hat. He was a new trendy type of leader for the era. And it doesn't matter, as long as it's not uniform, you see. So anyway, whether totalitarianism, leader worship, etc. are really on the upgrade and instance the fact that they are not apparently growing in this country and the USA. This is during World War II. He said, I must say I believe or fear that taking the world as a whole, these things are on the increase. Hitler, no doubt, will soon disappear. They knew that back then. But only at the expense of strengthening A, Stalin, the Soviet communist totalitarian state, B, the Anglo-American millionaires, and C, all sorts of petty Führers of the type of de Gaulle. That was General de Gaulle of France. All the national movements everywhere, even those that originate in resistance to the German domination, seem to take non-democratic forms, to group themselves around some superhuman Führer, such as Hitler, Stalin, Salazar, Franco, Gandhi, De Valera of Ireland. They're all varying examples. That's what they were doing at the time. The press was really building them up into superstar status, all the dictators, and to adopt the theory that the end justifies the means. That still runs true today. You're not running under democracy. You're simply brainwashed that you are. Everywhere the world movement seems to be in the direction of centralized economies which can be made to work, in quotation marks, in an economic sense, but which are not democratically organized, and which tend to establish a caste system. Caste system is a class system, you see. With this go the horrors of emotional nationalism and the tendency to disbelieve in the existence of objective truth, because all the facts we have to fit in with the words and prophecies of some infallible Führer. Already history has in a sense ceased to exist. That is, there's no such thing as a history of our own times which could be universally accepted. And the exact sciences are endangered as soon as the military necessity ceases to keep people up to the mark. Hitler can say that the Jews started the war, and if he survives, that will become official history. He can't say that 2 and 2 are 5 because for the purposes of, say, ballistics, they have to make 4. But if the sort of world that I'm afraid of arrives, a world of 2 or 3 great superstates which are unable to conquer one another, 2 and 2 could become 5 if the Führer wished it. That, so far as I can see, is the direction in which we're actually moving, though, of course, the process is reversible. As to the comparative immunity of Britain and the USA, whatever the pacifists, etc., may say, we have not gone totalitarian yet. And this is a very hopeful symptom. I believe very deeply, as I've explained in my book, The Lion and the Unicorn, in the English people, and in their capacity to centralize their economy without destroying freedom in doing so. But one must remember that Britain and the USA haven't been really tried. They haven't known defeat or severe suffering. And there are some bad symptoms to balance the good ones. To begin with, there's the general indifference to the decay of democracy. This is back in World War II. Do you realize, for instance, that no one in England under 26 years of age now has a vote? And that so far as one can see, the great mass of people of that age don't give a damn for this. You think the techniques of keeping us dumb and stupid and indifferent are new? Of course they're not. They've been used, but things that work are never tossed out by those who rule. And most folk are still the pros in every age, you see. They're kept worrying and scurrying and having the occasional beer in the pub or wherever it happens to be, and they feel they're alive, yada yada, and they don't really know what's going on. And as they up to the age of about 30, they're simply chasing sex today more so than ever. And they're encouraged that way. It's been created for them to do so. Anyway, so secondly, there's the fact that the intellectuals are more, this is very important. Secondly, there is the fact, remember I told you many times, that on board in the scientific system to run ours at all are the intellectuals and intelligentsia in universities and so on. It's the fact that the intellectuals are more totalitarian in outlook than the common people. On the whole, the English intelligentsia have opposed Hitler, but only at the price of accepting Stalin. Most of them are perfectly ready for dictatorial methods, secret police, systematic falsification of history, that's happening all the time now, as long as they feel that it is on our side. Indeed, the statement that we haven't a fascist movement in England largely means that the young at this moment look for their Führer elsewhere. One can't be sure that won't change, or one can't be sure that the common people won't think 10 years hence as the intellectuals do now. I hope they won't, I even trust they won't, but if so, it will be at the cost of a struggle. If one simply proclaims that all is for the best and doesn't point to the sinister symptoms, one is merely helping to bring totalitarianism nearer. And he goes on to talk about, he says, you also ask if I think the world tendency is towards fascism. Why do I support the war? It's a choice of evils. I fancy nearly every war is that, a choice of evils. I know enough of British imperialism not to like it, but I would support it against Nazism or Japanese imperialism as a lesser evil. Similarly, I would support the USSR against Germany because I think the USSR cannot altogether escape its past and retains enough of the original ideas of the revolution to make it a more hopeful phenomenon than Nazi Germany. I think and have thought ever since the war began in 1936 or thereabouts that our cause is the better, but we have to keep on making it the better, which involves constant criticism. So you glean little bits of what he knew back then, that the Intelligentsia are on board with basically this whole totalitarian form of governing, not just the people of one country, but the planet, you see. And there's only one system runs the world and runs all the different parties and plays the game, you see, on us. And when you go through that too, you find out that how many folk knew that you couldn't vote in Britain back in 1944 until you were 26 years of age. And again, it's talking about the memory hole for history, how they keep changing it. All you hear is from, again, most folk get their what they think is history from the History Channel nonsense, totally updated for the times we're living in today, or in movies. And they think it was all about suffragettes. They think, oh, but they got the vote for women long, long before. Oh, and here you go. So it just shows you how misinformed we really are. And then you go into this, you see. We talk about Orwell and Huxley. Now, this next letter, basically, is to George Orwell from Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley used to be his French teacher, in fact, at Eton. And he wrote Brave New World. Actually, it was 1931 it came out. So he had a different look on how we could be all cajoled and guided into this new system of totalitarianism. Whereas George Orwell still saw the totalitarian movements, the massive armies and uniforms and uniform leaders and so on. So he disagreed with how it could be brought in, this whole system. And in reality, I think they were both right, because during this war on terror, which is taking away the rights of almost everybody and gave the government gave itself the rights to spy on all of us all the time, because you're under a totally controlled society as never before. Everyone must be completely predictable, and that's where everything's electronic. It's updated every day by you, and the big boys have got complete personality, daily profiles updated on you by yourself. So you're predictable. Anyway, here's the letter from Huxley. It says, Huxley starts off the letter praising the book to Orwell, describing it as profoundly important. He continues that the philosophy of the ruling minority in 1984 is a sadism which has been carried to its logical conclusion by going beyond sex and denying it. Then Huxley switches gears and criticizes the book, writing, whether in actual fact the policy of the boot on the face can go on indefinitely seems doubtful. My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and of satisfying its lust for power. And these ways will resemble those which I describe in Brave New World. Basically, while praising 1984, Huxley argues that his version of the future was more likely to come to pass. And so that you wouldn't, by scientific means, you see, it won't be the boot standing on your face forever and stomping you forever. It'll be a kind of a nice furry moccasin or something, you see. And you won't recognize it as such for what it really is. Still, in other words, the intent is just the same, and the results are even more efficient because you cooperate then, you see. In Huxley's seemingly dystopic world state, the elite amuse the masses into submission. It's a very good expression. Massive entertainment and so on. with a mind-numbing drug as well called soma, and an endless buffet of casual sex. Does that ring a bell? Orwell's Oceania, on the other hand, keeps the masses in check with fear, thanks to an endless war, like war forever under terrorism, and a hyper-competent surveillance state. At first blush, they might seem like they're diametrically opposed, but in fact, an Orwellian world and a Huxleyan one are simply two different modes of oppression. But actually they're combined at the moment, before they go into the complete invisible one, you see. Obviously, we are nowhere near a dystopic version, but the power of both books is that they tap into our fears of the state. While Huxley might make you look askance at The Bachelor or Facebook, Orwell makes you recoil in horror at the government throwing around phrases like enhanced interrogation and surgical drone strikes. And I'll put the link up for that too. Actually, the whole letter to Orwell is awfully good. Actually, I will read the letter because it's too interesting. It was very kind of you to tell your publishers to send me a copy of your book. It arrived as I was in the midst of a piece of work that required much reading and consulting of references, and since poor sight makes it necessary for me to ration my reading, I had to wait a long time before being able to embark on 1984. Agreeing with all that the critics have written of it, I need not tell you yet once more how fine and profoundly important the book is. May I speak instead of the thing with which the book deals? Now listen to this too. This is from Aldous Huxley. The ultimate revolution. Now, don't forget that. The first hints of a philosophy of the ultimate revolution. The revolution which lies beyond politics and economics, and which aims at total subversion of the individual psychology and physiology, are to be found in the Marquis de Sade, who regarded himself as the continuator or the consummator of Robespierre, and Babeuf. The philosophy of the ruling minority in 1984 is a sadism which has been carried to its logical conclusion by going beyond sex and denying it. And he goes on to the boot in the face and so on. My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and of satisfying its lust for power. And these ways will resemble those which I described in Brave New World. I have had occasion recently to look into the history of animal magnetism. He's talking about hypnosis and so on. And how to indoctrinate people through even sleep and so on. It's much like the de-patterning and so on that was carried out by Cameron in Canada at the time, which got a lot of press later on, of course. That was MK Ultra, of course. And he says, I have been greatly struck by the way in which, for 150 years, the world has refused to take serious cognizance of the discoveries of Mesmer, Braid, Esdale, and the rest, partly because of the prevailing materialism and partly because of prevailing respectability. 19th century philosophers and men of science were not willing to investigate the odder facts of psychology for practical men, such as politicians, soldiers, and policemen, to apply in the field of government. Thanks to the voluntary ignorance of our fathers, the advent of the ultimate revolution was delayed for 5 or 6 generations. And that's what they mean by that ultimate revolution is total submission by the people who have been totally brought into a psychological and behavioral way of managing them all. Political correctness. Another lucky accident was Freud's inability to hypnotize successfully and his consequent disparagement of hypnotism. This delayed the general application of hypnotism to psychiatry for at least 40 years, but now psychoanalysis is being combined with hypnosis, and hypnosis has been made easy and indefinitely extensible through the use of barbiturate drugs, which induce a hypnoid and suggestible state in even the most recalcitrant subjects. Now remember too that this is a very old letter, and he knew of people who were testing other means of altering what we think and through the brain In Tavistock, for instance, he talks about that much later, not in this letter, where they actually put wires and electrodes in folks' brains. And then you had Delgado as well, doing it remotely by implants. And this famous one was a bull, and of course, but he was actually doing it with people too, with men, prisoners, and so on, and some from the military. So, and now, of course, we have Brzezinski yapping in the 1970s and the Technotronic era, between two ages and so on. The Technotronic era chapter of how electromagnetic signals can pulse through the air will affect the moods of people and control behavior and so on. Wi-Fi is everywhere now. And it says, with the next generation, I believe that the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning, well, that's already here. It's done totally. And narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people, suggestion, you see, into loving their servitude, as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. In other words, I feel that the nightmare of 1984 is destined to modulate into the nightmare of a world having more resemblance to that which I imagined in Brave New World. The change will be brought about as a result of a felt need for increased efficiency. Meanwhile, of course, there may be a large-scale biological and atomic war, in which case we'll have nightmares of other and scarcely imaginable kinds. So, just reading the letters and exchanges from people who mixed with an upper elite and who got lots of information and gossip at dinner tables and so on from the upper elites and all the different parties they attended. They knew a lot more, especially Huxley perhaps, in what was really being planned. Because his brother, of course, Huxley's brother, Julian Huxley, was the head of, UNESCO, and he made amazing speeches. I read him on the air. Go into the archive section at cuttingthroughthematrix.com and listen to me reading that whole speech he gave at the United Nations to do with Planned Parenthood, of course, and mandating who get born, who wouldn't, and how they would knock man off its pedestal as supreme kind of earthly being and bring him down to the level of animals and all the rest of it. It's all been done pretty well today. Now, keep in mind what Huxley said about intellectuals and the lust for power. You can put that into that too, the scientific class, you see, including all the climate scientists who get paid masses of money now, by our money, our tax money, to brainwash us for political reasons, for a whole Agenda 21 phenomenon. Karl Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses, but I say that totalitarianism is the opiate of the intelligentsia. Keep that in mind. And here's an article here written a few years ago, actually, I think 2 or 3 years ago, maybe a couple of years ago, on Justin Trudeau. 2013. It says, Justin Trudeau's mind may be a bit like a teenager's bedroom, which is nonsense. He's no teenager by any means. But the Liberal leader's recent praise for Chinese dictatorship. I'll read it again for the hard of thinking. The Liberal leader's recent praise for Chinese dictatorship was surely more a case of careless wording than careless thought. Surely it was, eh? Yeah, it must have been. He used dictatorship when he should have used something like sustainable, well-designed central coordination. Because, as you know, it's still a dictatorship in China. Remember the lust for dictatorships, as Huxley was saying? Mr. Trudeau was asked at a ladies' night function which nation's administration he admired most outside of Canada. His response was, there's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green fastest. We need to start investing in solar. The contention that China is some sort of green model is flat out ridiculous. This week's 2013 IEA World Economic Outlook confirmed that the smog-bound Middle Kingdom, China, is destined to be the world's largest and fastest growing user of fossil fuels, in particular coal, for at least the next decade. Criticism arose not over that true gaffe, but over praise for dictatorship. But was Mr. Trudeau really saying anything outrageous? Dictatorship, that is control of people's lives, has always been the central motivating force of leftist ideology. Praise for dictatorship is a more efficient and even more moral system. It has a long history amongst not just fellow travellers of communism and useful idiots on the left. Prominent economists such as Paul Samuelson thought it inevitable after World War II that Soviet communism would outstrip the West. In his younger days, Mr. Trudeau's father Pierre declared, remember Pierre led the Comintern and the National Communists of Canada to the Comintern meeting in Moscow. We have a great deal to learn from the Soviet Union. This was Justin's dad talking. As Liberal Prime Minister, he was an unabashed fan of both the Castro and Mao regimes. In the wake of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, when the folk were trying to get democracy in China and run over with tanks and stuff, he took Justin, the present Prime Minister, and his brothers to China, where he was treated as a hero. Support for dictatorship tends to be based on power, lust, or economic ignorance, even on the part of Nobel economists. Everything's politicized, folks, and given you for a reason. It went through a bit of rough spot on the week of the Soviet collapse, but had already been building a new head of steam in the environmental movement. You better believe it, because it's not environmental. That's the excuse that's been used. That's a Trojan horse. The enormously influential 1972 book Limits to Growth called for a totally new form of society. That was a Club of Rome, remember? Again, go to the archives, cuttingthroughmatrix.com. By the way, when you're there, have it tossing a donation my way once in a while, because I'm telling you, for the amount of stuff I put out over the years, this hardly anything comes in here at all. And you're getting all that information for free out there. Massive website. And mention me too once in a while if you're on some other show. And where you get the information from, it helps. It really helps. There's only a few do, and they're not in Canada or the States. The ones that are abroad tend to do it more so. Anyway, it says a totally new form of society. That was Limits to Growth, with much greater restrictions on human freedom. Well, that's where you are now, folks. In 2012, one of the Limits authors, Jorgen Randers, produced another book, 2052 it was called, launched the annual meeting of the World Wildlife Fund, in which he specifically praised the Chinese model again and expressed concern at the possibility of counter-revolution. By the way, I've heard the BBC do documentaries on them, and other countries have done the same thing, praising China and saying that it's a model state for the world, where the top intelligentsia order you to do something, you better just jump to it and hop to it, and that's it. That's why the UN has said the same thing. It is the model state for the world. This article goes on to say Maurice Strong, the man who organised much of the UN's political manoeuvring behind the climate fiasco, very important guy. He was picked up by Rockefeller years ago. He was a young guy and trained to push all this stuff. But he's always been a Sinophile, Maurice Strong. He loves China. Following his implication in the Iraq oil for food scandal, Mr. Strong moved to Beijing. They're all corrupt, by the way, all corrupt. And this article goes on and on and on, but the thing what I'm trying to say is, that's the present Prime Minister now of Canada, who made the gaffe about, to him it wouldn't be a gaffe, it wasn't a Freudian slip as such. He really said what he believed at the time. It wasn't afterwards he realised that the folk weren't ready for it yet. They must keep the deception up, you see. And he's going to push the whole carbon tax, everything through, the whole agenda for the United Nations and the distribution of your wealth across the planet in December at the Paris Climate Conference. You wonder who voted for the guy, if they actually remember any of these kind of things he's said before, or do they care? Or is it the old story like Britain now too? Very few folk are voting. They're so disgusted with all of politicians. And they don't know. They just know something's kind of wrong, that nothing changes, but they don't know why it doesn't change. It doesn't change because it's not planned to change. There's one agenda. The right wing does it, what it's supposed to do when it's put in power. is to keep you going, thinking it's all for the nation. And meanwhile, Harper of Canada, the Prime Minister, just taking over, of course, he's gone now. He's getting taken over by Justin Trudeau. Harper signed us all into TPP and all these secret deals. Where's the democracy there? It doesn't exist. And Pierre Trudeau was the same way. And now his son, the globalist, is going to push it all the way too. One agenda, with all the same goals for the same group above it all that run it all. Because they don't believe in democracy. Margaret Thatcher said something similar when she retired supposedly from being the Prime Minister of Britain. She said she now belonged to an elite club. And she was speaking of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. It's set up a long time ago, before it was called that, a different name. It was a Milner Group at the time, to bring in a world governmental system. They set up the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements. They set up the League of Nations that became the United Nations. They set up the trade deal system for the whole planet. We don't vote for them. It's a private club. She's saying we can get more things done now because we all know each other, all the ex-prime ministers and presidents, and that we don't have to go through the cumbersome exercise of the public knowing about it so they can get things done the exact same way as the communists got things done in China. That's why they gave communism in China, to make it happen fast. You see? Because the Chinese didn't know what democracy was. Therefore, they could ram it ahead under communism. The whole agenda of obedience and indoctrination, with all the behaviorists and neuroscientists on board with it to indoctrinate the children. But then we don't care today in the West because most folk have had the total indoctrination in the West too, without even knowing it. And they still think they're free. It works well. That's all the time I have to go through this, and there's a lot more to this. Now from Hamish myself, from Ontario, Canada, where it already goes below freezing at night. God help us with carbon taxes. It's good night, and may your God or your gods go with you. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on November the 1st, 2015. This is part 2 of an episode I did last week where I talked about totalitarianism being the opiate of the intelligentsia. And intelligentsia have in all ages basically been advisors and so on that have coteries of friends of similar minds who want some kind of revolution where they can set themselves up in power naturally. Today, we have that going on naturally. They're actually used at the lower levels, but you'll find that academia is completely on board with transforming society into the way they want the world to be run by themselves naturally, the scientific community. And that's why you have all the nonsense about global warming and etc. as they bring science up to its, what they call its rightful position in governing the people. So you'll find lots of literature out there on that too. Of course, I've gone through so much of it over the years, I can't be bored going over it again. But this is the age we're in, and I talked about Bertrand Russell, talking about it too in the 1940s and 50s, where science would take its rightful place. And if there was going to be a tyranny, he said, I would rather it be a scientific tyranny. He also said a scientific tyranny would be utterly ruthless. It would demolish all the old norms and bring in the new, completely way of living actually, a new way of life for every single person and for this global system. You understand what power is, remember. Most folk can't understand what power is because in their own lives they're pretty limited in power. You have so many agencies above you with more power than you, and you're all subservient to them basically. They have authority by law over you. And we obey in many, many ways. We can be coerced into obeying by fear and the threat of reprisal upon you. And you can also have economic control. It's a big one, economic control. That's what they used to in Britain and countries like that across Europe, to have less children after World War II, for instance. They made it almost impossible for a lot of families, even working class families too, to really basically maintain themselves with the actual numbers of reproduction. So they fell behind, and that was all intentional as well. There's always a bigger power and a bigger agenda in this geopolitical goal of the real quiet tyrants behind the scenes. They're not so quiet amongst themselves, but you will see seldom, if ever, anything really published upon them. They have lots of front groups, and they get what they want by simply, and get away with it by simply not appearing so much in the newspapers. And last week too, I started off by a letter that was exchanged between George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, guys who wrote in their novel systems, their novel books, I should say, about totalitarian systems. Remember, they lived through an era of totalitarianism with revolutions beginning, well, even in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and the Bolshevik Revolution and the introduction of communism, which came out of it, which was really, again, another front for a small group of people to take over and run the world, what they called scientifically. And they were utterly ruthless indeed in the Soviet Union. But this same system of socialism was picked up on by the bankers who funded revolution in Russia, Western bankers who had their own idea of how the world should be run, naturally with themselves at the top. The really big private banking families that ran international systems of debt and credit and all the rest of it to nations. And out of that, you had the Royal Institute of International Affairs that came out of that, the Lord Milner Group in Britain, with their view of global domination, with the wealthy folk running the whole world, the presently wealthy folk at that time running the whole planet, the proper people, I might say, and everyone obeying and doing what they were told to do. So that's still the goal, of course, of power. Power never changes. The lust for power has many fronts, many faces, but it's always the same thing in the end. But we're really on our way to it, been on our way to it for an awful long time, and the creation of nations and amalgamating them into, it's like business consolidations, bringing the countries into blocks. We forget about the Soviet bloc, they called it. Now you have the European bloc of traders in the European Union, and the North American bloc as well, that's going into the whole of the Americas block up, which was always intended to do. And a borderless system of the free flow. They used to say labor and goods, now they say people and goods, because they don't need the labor anymore. But it won't stop mass immigration. That's part of the plan again too. So we're going through big changes. Most folk can't see it. They get hung up on the politicians that are placed in front of them, and they're coerced in many ways too, and coaxed into voting for who the elite want. And it doesn't really matter, because they've all been vetted by the present existing elite anyway. They depend on them for their financial backing even to run. And nothing's given in politics for nothing, including backing by big international corporations or anybody else, for that matter, who's got lots of money. There's always something to be paid back by changing systems and introducing laws and various other things too. Nothing really changes. Sad thing, but it's true, isn't it? Things are very predictable because of that too. But getting back to Huxley, I'll just mention this a little bit again of Huxley's, who read George Orwell's 1984, and he'd already put his own book out in the 1930s, Aldous Huxley, of Brave New Worlds, where who really was writing about the final outcome, a transition beyond the overt aggressive force that was going to be used to get people into this brave new world, where George Orwell was really going through, again, right after World War II, the big movements who wanted totalitarianism, and they'd use war to get there, basically. So you had the total force of George Orwell, and again, in a completely monitored society. Everyone was on camera, everyone was monitored all the time. right down to what they were thinking almost. And he didn't go beyond that into the scientifically controlled system so much, although science was used for indoctrination purposes in the totalitarian state in both the books. But in Huxley's view, he saw the beyond that particular era of blind force being used in fear, until the folk were compliant and they accepted their obedience or slavery without any qualms, because scientific techniques were to be used upon them and reared them from birth, basically, which we have now in indoctrination. It's through everything, and all your fiction as well as non-fiction. But this article here, is where Aldous Huxley is replying to Orwell, he says the first hints of a philosophy of the ultimate revolution. That's what they call it at the top. This is the revolution which lies beyond politics and economics, and which aims at total subversion of the individual's psychology and physiology. Awfully interesting, isn't it? Are to be found in the Marquis de Sade, who regarded himself as the continuator or the consummator of Robespierre and Babeuf. The philosophy of the ruling minority in 1984, so he's criticizing 1984, is a sadism which has been carried to its logical conclusion by going beyond sex and denying it, where in actual fact the policy of the boot on the face can go on indefinitely seems doubtful. My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and of satisfying its lust for power. Now, for folk who don't lust for power, it's almost it's too abstract to comprehend. But you have to understand, tyrants are born amongst you every year, potential tyrants, across the whole planet. And they'll use every available system and systems that already exist to get there. Often they'll get behind things and work behind things. And at the right time, they come to the fore. And they'll set up the circumstances so that they can come to the fore. But he's talking about the different techniques. So the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and satisfying its lust for power. And these ways will resemble those which I described in Brave New World. Then he goes into the early systems of animal magnetism and hypnotism and so on. This is partly because of the prevailing materialism and partly because of prevailing respectability. 19th century philosophers and men of science were not willing to investigate the odder facts of psychology for practical men, such as politicians, soldiers, and policemen, to apply in the field of government. In other words, they hadn't looked into these techniques of running the people, you see, and controlling them. Thanks to the voluntary ignorance of our fathers. Now, he's thanking the ignorance of not going into the Bernays techniques, for instance, that now have spawned off into many different subcategories of a science and social psychology, etc., and behaviorism, which now are using all marketing techniques and behavior of different spectrums of society into manipulating everybody, you see. And they advise your governments and your educational systems on how to put things across and in ways which the suspect or the recipient is going to be unaware that they're being technically brainwashed in a sense. He says, so thanks to the voluntary ignorance of the fathers, the advent of the ultimate revolution was delayed for 5 or 6 generations. Another lucky accident was Freud's inability to hypnotize successfully and his consequent disparagement of hypnotism. This delayed the general application of hypnotism to psychiatry for at least 40 years. And then he goes into, again, psychoanalysis being combined now, after this, with hypnosis. And hypnosis has been made easy and indefinitely extensible through the use of barbiturates, which induce a hypnoid and suggestible state. Well, so is the television, folks, now. Yeah. And we're talking about using scientific techniques now. And even the most recalcitrant subjects. Within the next generation, I believe the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning, And there's many studies about the womb and how the baby reacts inside the womb to all kinds of different kinds of music, how it'll adapt even to, initially it'll move all over the place inside the womb and during pregnancy to certain loud things like rock music and then rap music. But eventually when it realizes it's not going to, this thing goes on without harming it, it'll adapt to even that. So it's in the womb. As instruments of government, then clubs and prisons, and the lust for power. So he doesn't deny that the lust for power will always be there amongst the ruling oligarchy. He says that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. In other words, I feel that the nightmare of 1984 is destined to modulate, to change gradually into the nightmare of a world having more resemblance to that which I imagined in Brave New World. The change will be brought about as a result of a felt need for increased efficiency. Meanwhile, of course, there may be a large-scale biological and atomic war, in which case we shall have nightmares of other and scarcely imaginable kinds. These guys were in the know, and Huxley maybe even more so, because the Huxleys were, according to the brother of Aldous Huxley, Julian Huxley, who was well up there at the United Nations and Planned Parenthood and population reduction and all the rest of it, he said he and his, talking about families of who've been in leadership positions, he said, we belong to the scientific community. That was Julian Huxley. They're the scientific masters who would control the world on behalf of the other specialized groups and categories of masters that would control the world, you see. And last week I also talked about Pierre Trudeau and now his son, who they put in as Prime Minister of Canada. And it's quite interesting because everything's sold to you as a consumer. I was listening to one of these social psychologists and the evolutionary psychologists and a whole bunch of categories of them all working together. But this guy was from Canada and he works in a university, and he said that they packaged Justin Trudeau, but it was much the same way as his dad was packaged, but that's another thing. But they packaged him just much the same way by as if you were selling a rock star to the young, you see. Similar to how they sold Bill Clinton initially into getting all the women voters in from to Justin Trudeau, said this psychologist. He says he's a pretty boy. That's his actual words. And he says he's the kind that they would use to make a music star, for instance, and all the young girls would scream and go crazy over this image of the pretty young boy, the pretty boyish features, you see, but not manly, said the psychologist. And that overrode the politician's actual failure to answer anything in a kind of manly way, you see, during his running up for the election. And that because people voted for his appearance and for, a young, trendy guy, etc., and etc. So that's how they voted him in. So science was heavily used to get in Pierre Trudeau. But they use these characters for, doesn't matter if it's left wing, right wing, or it's all the same to me because it's all planned long in advance. In fact, I'm pretty sure many of them are groomed for many, many years, and they're actually told when their turn will come. I think we definitely are in the scientifically controlled system. Have been for an awful long time, throughout the 20th century into this particular century. And I mentioned Pierre Trudeau, who was literally a communist. And remember, there was even articles put out at the time, I think, where they said that the communists were told outside of Russia not to say they were communists. They're under different party names, and they would get into power by deception. And oddly enough, when Pierre Trudeau got in, he says, we did it, we actually got in. But he was talking to the fellow travellers that they actually got him in way back years ago. And he drastically changed Canada too with his policies. So now you have the son of Pierre Trudeau, who again rode the coattails, according to that psychologist, of his daddy. And if it had not been another 30 years, nobody would remember his daddy anyway, so they wouldn't vote for him. So you ride the coattails of your daddy, who was also sold as a kind of superstar type. They had him with a broad brimmed hat half the time, ridiculously broad, and a kind of almost a Sherlock Holmes type black coat on, and he'd whirl for the cameras and pirouette and things like that. He was meant to be trendy and with it and hip, as they said back then. So now they've given him the pretty boy image to get Pierre's son in. And you have to remember that whoever they put in really, generally, not always, but generally, they're simply told what to do by their advisors and so on. Pierre Trudeau was far sharper intellectually and a great debater, spontaneously so in Parliament, than I think Justin Trudeau could ever really be. But that doesn't matter. They've got in the guy who's going to push the next phase of globalism for Canada and for sustainability and for the carbon idea of global warming, etc., and all the taxes for the big corporations that are going to benefit from swapping all these carbon credits, etc., and changing the way that we live, again, scientifically, the guys behind them. Last week I also touched on an article, a good article too, which is kind of similar to what I'm heading at here, and it was by Peter Foster, Justin Trudeau and the China Derangement Syndrome. And that's where Justin, when he was over in China, actually said that he praised their dictatorship because he gets so much done. He goes through this policy of pretending to pacify and appease the people, you see. You simply got it done, all your big plans by the Intelligentsia, as they call themselves, that runs the communist system of China. So this is what this Justin Trudeau admires. This article goes on to say that the contention that China is some sort of green model is flat out ridiculous. It says this week's in its 2013 IEA World Economic Outlook confirmed that the smog-bound Middle Kingdom is destined to be the world's largest and fastest growing user of fossil fuels. It already is. In particular, coal for at least another decade. Now remember, under the free trade agreements, these countries who sign on, and are still classed as third world, by the way, even though China's the manufacturer for the planet, and we're all financing them in China. They don't have to go along with the policies that advocate for everybody else to use across the world, because they're classed as third world. India is the same, and every newcomer that gets the same status under the World Trade Organization doesn't have to start paying taxes on anything to do with carbon-related or climate change until they say that they're now completely self-sufficient. Anyway, it says, dictatorship, that is, control of people's lives, has always been the central motivating force of leftist ideology. Praise for dictatorship as a more efficient and even more moral system has a long history among not just fellow travelers and useful idiots on the left. Prominent economists such as Paul Samuelson thought it inevitable after World War II that Soviet communism would outstrip the West. As in his younger days, Mr. Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, declared, "We have a great deal to learn from the Soviet Union." As Liberal Prime Minister, he was an unabashed fan of both the Castro and Mao regimes. In the wake of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, he took Justin and his brothers to China, where he was treated as a hero. Remember, this guy's now, the son's now Prime Minister of Canada. It says, support for dictatorship tends to be based on power lust or economic ignorance, even on the part of noble economists. It went through a bit of a rust spot in the wake of the Soviet collapse, but has already been building a new head of steam in the environmental movement. You understand how things change? The agenda goes forth. It's got many, many Trojan horses. Many are on the go right now. This sexual equality, all these different equality things right now are really Trojan horses off the left. This is the enormously influential 1972 book called Limits to Growth. This is where they wanted to deindustrialize the West altogether. Calls for a totally new form of society with much greater restrictions on human freedom. Isn't it amazing? And here we have it. We need 2001 to make it happen. In 2012, One-Off Limits, authors Jorgen Randers produced another book called 2052, launched at the annual meeting of the World Wildlife Fund, in which he specifically praised the Chinese model and expressed concern at the possibility of counter-revolution. So they have to be put a lot of work into in a totalitarian system under whatever guise which we have today, which is terrorism, to stop any counter-revolution for your way of life being drastically changed by tyrants. And then it goes on to say that Maurice Strong, the man who organized much of the United Nations political maneuvering behind the climate fiasco, has always been a Sinophile, a China lover. Following his implication in the Iraq oil for food scandal, Mr. Strong moved to Beijing. It's true enough that all these guys are really tyrants as they go up there and pretend to be so moral, and they have the right to guide all of you because they're so moral, you see. And they're always involved in awful scandals. But being tyrants, then actually they're entitled to that. As this is not just the ardent eco-left that sees China as a model. In 2006, Peter Kertsakian, a prominent Calgary-based energy economist, wrote a book with a hysteria-inducing title called 1,000 Barrels a Second. In it, he claimed that China was lucky because it had a golden opportunity to engineer a society that does not fully experience the level of oil addiction that we've known in the West. And it goes on and on. It's a good article, actually. I'll put that up again. I'll put them all up at the end of this part 2. But it's awfully interesting that here's an article here, for instance. I mentioned Maurice Strong. You find it on Wikipedia. He was actually picked up by Rockefeller and pushed and trained into the position. He is this global leader of the environmentalist system. He brought us many of the ongoing meetings we still have today with biodiversity and the rights of the animals and the trees and everything else, but none for the humans, etc., etc. But it says here, in 1976, at the request of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Strong returned to Canada to head the newly created national oil company called Petro-Canada. He then became chairman of the Canada Development Investment Corporation, the holding company for some of Canada's principal government-owned corporations. But later on, actually, he was brought back to privatise our electrical system in Ontario, for instance. Everyone who's been involved in has been big scandals, you know. Also, it says on December 31st, 1986, American Water Development Incorporated, a corporation controlled by Maurice Strong and his associates, William Ruckelshaus, Richard Lamb, Samuel Bellsberg, and Alexander Crutchfield, Jr., filed an application with the District Court for Water Division 3 in Alamoso, Colorado, for the right to pump underground water from lands of the Louis Maria Baccagrande, number 4, and another lands in Sagutu County, Colorado, in Colorado's San Luis Valley, and sell it to water districts in the Front Range urban corridor of Colorado. He's into all things to do with what you need to live, you understand. That's what I'm talking about. Remember, too, that Pierre Trudeau, the dad, one of his best pals was Harold Lasky, who was an outright communist, basically, who taught Marxism in universities in Britain and so on. I'll put that up tonight too. And then I'd just like to touch on this article to do with the inner circle they expect to be picked, it's probably already picked by the masters of the world, around Justin Trudeau. And who are they for these liberal lefties, you know? And you've got to remember back to talks I've given at cuttingthroughthematrix.com over many, many years of the history of the group that set out to basically take over the world's supply of everything that folk needed to live on, but also the complete wealth of the nations across the world, and bring in a common political system with ultimately a central government. And that was, again, the Lord Alfred Milner Group, based in London, that became the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. Group members also came out as the Trilateral Commission, the big players that manage all of these things. And even their historian for the CFR branch in the US put out in his own book that this group's been running the world since at least the late or even the mid-1800s. This article says, every few weeks through much of 2014, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau met on Parliament Hill with an eclectic group of business executives, university professors, and think tank policy wonks, as they call them, along with a few of his own members of parliament. This article talks about the Liberals not getting round to formally announcing the roster of Trudeau's Economic Council of Advisors until almost the end of 2014, about 8 months after its first meeting. Far from trying to attract maximum attention to it, they seem to want to leave the council largely unnoticed. And that's more important because advisors behind presidents and prime ministers are generally the most important people, since they really run the show, you know. The prime ministers and presidents are sold like packages to the general public. You're a consumer, and they package up for you, the consumer. That's the whole making phenomenon that has been on the go for a long time. So what was important for us, for this group to have, was meet a few times, is to have done substantive work before we started talking too much about it, said Toronto MP Chrystia Freeland, who co-chairs a council with Nova Scotia MP Scott Bryson. We wanted this not to be about press releases. The suspicion in Ottawa, whenever a politician assembles a blue-chip panel, is that deep thinkers are window dressing, while the real decisions will be made by the usual partisan operatives. Assessing the influence of Trudeau's group will have to wait until the Liberals' 2015 election platform is unveiled. Well, hasn't been even done yet. Still, members of the council say they sense real potential. Discussions are very in-depth and tend to get into the weeds a great deal. It's not just blue skying from 40,000 feet, says council member Mike Muffet, professor at Western University Ivey Business School. And they go on about Muffet himself, amongst academic specialists. Again, academia and intelligentsia are on board, certain ones, you see. And it says, too, given Trudeau's emphasis on middle-class income stagnation, it's no surprise he's turning to professors such as Korak and Milligan, who's another Maclean's writer and contributor, for ideas. He mentions George Gosby, the chief executive of Calgary-based Alta Group Capital Inc., who previously served in the Economic Advisory Council of Jim Flaherty, Harper's finance minister from 2006 until shortly before his death last spring. It brings to the table an Albertan business perspective not often associated with the federal Liberals. And then they go to Frank McKenna and other names that the public might have heard before. Although it's not really in the packaging, as I say, they don't package the advisors. They're behind the scenes. It's more important to keep them quiet. Now, this article talks about Trudeau's predecessor, Stephen Harper, and he said the media says it was a climate change skeptic, but the new Prime Minister brings a different attitude. Remember that science is to control us all, and this whole scientific kerfuffle, with all the different scientists on board with it, because they're going to raise their own status into a more important status than they already have. Before, folks used to pretty well ignore the climate. It was either raining or it was dry or it was sunny. But not anymore now. It's very, very important, you see, to bring us all to our knees so they can control us all. Anyway, it says, for years, climate change activists have criticised Canadian government as a global warming laggard. And the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who has been in power since 2006, has never taken climate change seriously. And lots of folk haven't taken it seriously because they know it's bogus. Anyway, it says, when Canada failed to meet the carbon cuts set in the Kyoto Protocol, a treaty Canada signed and ratified under a previous government, Harper simply withdrew his country, quite rightly too. But a surprise election of Justin Trudeau yesterday promises to change that perception. The Liberal Party leader emphasised the very real danger of climate change and pledged his support for what he called a pan-Canadian approach to the issue. In 2015, pretending that we have to choose between this economy and the environment is as harmful as it is wrong, he said in a speech earlier this year, written by a speechwriter, obviously. It says, even with the resounding win, however, it may provide surprisingly difficult for new Prime Minister Trudeau to enacting strong environmental and energy policy at the federal level in Canada. Control over a Canadian environmental and energy policy rests largely with the country's powerful provincial leaders. Well, that's already been settled because a few months ago I read it on the air that the federal government, even under Harper, had told all the provinces, the parliaments in the provinces, to put forward their ideas for basically environmental policies, so it's good to do a federal one. It says, indeed, the country explicitly leaves authority over natural resource management to the provinces, and many Canadians still recall an ill-fated attempt in the 1980s by the federal, almost said federal, but as federal government to grab a larger share of the profits from energy resources in individual provinces. It says that program was championed by none other than Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father. Provinces have enormous authority in so many areas that there are huge regional differences on the issue, said Barry Raby, professor of public policy at the University of Michigan. Canadians have struggled mightily to put together a federal policy that addresses emissions. For these reasons, Trudeau appears keen on implementing a carbon pricing scheme that would set targets for emission reduction at the federal level and allow for provinces to design programs independently to meet those goals. Now, who would be the principal advisors to Trudeau? And it says here, General Butts, a principal advisor. Gerald Butts has been friends with Trudeau since their McGill University days and is said to be so close to him that he had a hand in writing the eulogy Trudeau famously delivered at the funeral of his father, former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And now, it actually says here that Butts was Principal Secretary to Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty and is the former President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada, Prince Philip's organization. The guy that wrote the book, remember, Prince Philip? That if he could come back as another life form, he come back as a virus and kill off a good chunk of humanity. So that's the principle. Now, these advisors are more important than the guy in front, believe you me. Because they're the real, radical totalitarian types that don't care about... They actually have the communist system when they tell you at the top, you jump or else, and everyone then knows what or else means for sure. And then Katie Telford, National Election Campaign Co-Chair, and a few other ones too I'll put up. Amongst them too are Stephen Bronfman, Chief Fundraiser, the scion of the Bronfman Seagram's liquor family. That's the guys who started the whole incredible story, actually. It's a good book to read, is Peter Newman's book on the Bronfman family and how they set up and ran the illicit liquor trade during the roaring 20s and 30s and so on. And incredible life these guys have had. This is set up way in advance. The politicians getting paid off to bring it in, the prohibition against booze, knowing that they'd have the complete monopoly of all the booze, and they ran it in from Canada to the States. And then when the Canada also made it prohibitive too, and the States allowed it again, they just reversed the flow. Incredible story of how they got their billions and how they made their booze as well. They brought in whiskey from Scotland. The barrels that still had a lot of real Scotch in it, and they put battery acid in it to leach out the remaining alcohol and made up their own concoction, you see, and they sold it into the States. And that was the real big mafia in its day, utterly ruthless too. But anyway, that's another one, is Stephen Bronfman, a descendant of old Sam Bronfman. But they're respectable now because, it doesn't matter how you start in this system, as long as you become stinking rich, then you're suddenly respectable. And then all the other different characters who'll be on board with it too. But you'll have many more that are not mentioned because they're too important, I bet you. But it just shows you that nothing's ever as it appears to be. And so anyway, here you have one of the guys was head of the World Wildlife Fund for Canada. They're on board with the whole climate change thing, and they're taking away of all human rights, etc., from people, where you can live, how you can live, and all the rest of it. So the whole climate agenda is going to rampage ahead like never before. It's going to be absolutely amazing to live through the next few years, actually, as they bring this in. It'll be gradual to start with, of course. They won't tax you too much, but they'll start increasing it until you can't drive, or you'll need permits to drive for carbon, and you'll probably eventually get a rationing system. And I'm sure it's worked out years ago by the World Totalitarian Movement, you see, that once they bring in the driverless cars, you'll only be allocated according to your status in society and the justification for even having a vehicle under Agenda 21. They'll have one day you jump in your driverless car and the voice will come on saying, sorry, you've used your quota of mileage for the month or whatever it happens to be, and you can't go anywhere. Remember too, the restriction of movement is a very important thing for all totalitarian systems. Always has been, always will be. But we're living through the ongoing agenda, of course, and Canada is going to go further and further into the mire as it brings in the new system. It is really interesting, though, to study the social sciences and those involved in marketing who understand behaviorism and social psychology, all of these different things. The guys who specialize in selling you things, who wrap things into packages, including personalities, all fake, of course, and sell it to you like they sell the cars. You know, when they sell the car on a lonely road where there's no other vehicles, of course, and the thing's going over 100 miles an hour with ease and comfort. It doesn't tell you anything about the car or the maintenance or costs or guarantee of the transmission or anything like that. They sell you a fantasy, you see. And it's always been like that for an awful long time, the selling of fantasy. Something to make you happy, and they package these little pop stars up with the same kind of techniques, of course, and to try to get the women's vote on board with it too, and always, unfortunately, tends to work. And they get the young Trudeau, for instance, who's still, well, he's really in his 40s, but he looks a lot younger. And as I say, that social professor talked about, the social science professor talked about him being like a little pretty boy that they package and sell as pop stars. And as long as they get in, it doesn't matter. As long as the party gets in, and like his father has said, it doesn't matter, because then once you're in, you can do what you want. And we know what they want to do, which is the whole international global agenda, of course, for their masters, who really are always behind the scenes in every single country in the world. But they still play this left-wing versus right-wing nonsense up, because, as I say, the bankers funded and set up the communist system in the first place. And remember, too, the international bankers want to control society. They are guaranteed their payments, then all their massive compound interest, etc. And they can have you living the way that they decide through their academic specialists, how you should be living, you see, instead of having free choices in different things, etc., etc. Until you get to the stage that Aldous Huxley said, you get to where the people would love their servitude. Remember, too, in this Marxist system, loved by the bankers, that they have a division of labour. In Brave New World, you had all of the foresight into what became genetic engineering, where the different categories of important down to the lessers in society would be given, would be bred specifically for their particular tasks at hand. You wouldn't give ones at the bottom, for instance, a high intellectual ability, and stick them on a conveyor belt, just picking out little odds and ends on the belts. That would be reserved for those who had their junk genes, you might say, removed from them. The genes give you your personality and some of your IQ as well. And you see genetics completely going in that direction too for such a long, long time. This is an old agenda, remember, folks. And political selling and packaging of their particular frontmen or women is an old idea, which works awfully well amongst the general populace that doesn't really know much about what's going on. And they expect the media, like Brzezinski said, to do the reasoning for them. And if the media doesn't say, you better watch and be awfully careful about this person you're thinking about putting in power, because here's what they're real like, and here's what they really want to do, etc., which is destroy your country, internationalize it completely into a very old idea of how the world should really be by international revolutionaries. Remember, most revolutions are bloodless, they're cultural. And Yuri Bezmenov talked about that too, and how that incredible success of changing the West by changing the culture through academia and through entertainment and all the rest of it, how they could change the culture of the West and demolish that which kept it strong. And it was awfully successful. No, I don't cry over spilt milk, because what's the point? What's past is past. And I don't become some kind of cheerleader either for the general population, because you can't tell people what to think or how they should view things. It's up to them. And if they choose to be ignorant of things, willfully ignorant, there's nothing you can do about that. And the conditioning everyone's had today is so incredibly successful, awfully successful, through scientific programming, as Lord Bertrand Russell said. The scientific techniques that are used through school, even preschool, and through all children's fiction too, is meant to socialize them into political correctness, what really is nice and what's bad regarding topics and so on, thoughts that you might have, so that you self-censor yourself, you police yourself, you police your own mind throughout your entire life to be a good person. It's awfully interesting. The social psychologists too have terms for it, where you hear the people getting up in front of the populace today, even in local events and things like that, and they call it virtue signaling. And virtue, of course, is the right way to think and the right morals to have and ideas to have, all ones which have been okayed and stamped with the quality of seal of approval by the masters of the world, you see, in your culture. And I call it also social preening. That's how I call it. It's a form of not just signaling, but preening in public, where they come out with all the, even in local events, they come out with all the right things. They believe in sexual equality of all kinds of types of sexuality, etc. They believe in the climate change. We're going to do a lot about it. That they tell you up front, I'm so good. Everything is politically correct. I believe in, and I'm saying right now to show you how good I am with virtue and the social, the virtue signal and the virtue preen in front of the audience, you see. That's a done deal today. You see it all over the place. That's their credentials for getting up in front of you. And it's like a tape recorder that's been downloaded into everybody's brain by the masters of science, of course, of the mind, and cultural training. It's all been done. And so you have displays of this virtue preening, you might say. How good am I? You must see how good I am, and with all the right things to save the world and save the polar bears, and of course they're all going to drown when there's no North Pole nonsense, etc. All that stuff, and they say it with a deadpan face. And that's scary, folks, because when the same group are told by their masters through non-fiction and fiction incessantly that this particular group is bad, they will become the ruthless commissar types who will turn and execute people down the road. That's how it works for ridiculous things, for even having opinions. And I really mean that too. That's the scary thing about humanity. When you really read up on the types of executions they had in the Soviet system or in the communist China system, you can't fathom it. The people would condemn them with straight faces for the things they condemned them for and had them executed. Never mind the people who actually did the executions as well. It's horrific, actually. And it's always been of interest to me as to how they can play up the Nazi atrocities, and where you have over 80-odd million people slaughtered during the whole Soviet era. There's an absolute silence on it. Silence. But I don't get stuck on countries, because the same phenomenon, as Plato said, basically, if you want to alter human behavior, you study how they've acted in the past to introduce certain morals and modes of behaving, etc. And you can, as long as you know the format and study it and introduce it in the right sequence, you can change it again, and they'll behave exactly the same way again. And that can happen in any country, you see. That's why we're the most scientifically observed and studied creature on the planet. Not the ants, not the birds and bees or anything like that, but humans, you see. Because those who lust after power And that's so important to say. You understand that there are people who lust for power. I've met some of them throughout my life, and I've listened to them talk, and they all sound the same. It doesn't matter what particular form of totalitarianism they stand for. They all believe in using helpers in academia to train the generations of children into being the obedient, very obedient servants of them, to behave and act the way that they're told to without question. It's always the same thing. So Nazism, fascism, communism, all have the same goals, end goals. They all end up the same place anyway. And that's why the big boys that came out with all of this, who funded all parties and all sides during the conflicts of the early 20th centuries all through it, do fund all sides. They know that they can get their goals through. It doesn't matter if it's done through someone under the guise of a communist system or a liberal system or a right-wing system. It's all the same agenda which they ultimately control. None of these parties, you'll notice, ever says anything, ever, there's an awfully good reason for it, about doing away with the current inadequate, corrupt system of finance through central banking, and how what's the point in trying to earn money if it's constantly getting devalued? It's like trying to create a carpet on a loom while the one you're standing on is being unrolled underneath you all the time. But we say this is normal, this is good, and they call it a science of economics. And we get crashed 2 or 3 times a century now and plundered by the big bankers, and nothing changes. Why is that? Why are they all these parties on board with the same system? They won't change. It's because there's only one agenda with one bunch of global masters who rolled it out under Cecil Rhodes and then the Alfred Milner Group in Britain, the Royal Institute of National Affairs, CFR, Trilateral Group, all the same bunch who brought in the World Bank, the League of Nations, then the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, all of these private associations that now rule our lives, and we don't vote for a single one of them. It's not up for voting, you see. That's what's so important. It's startling, isn't it? It's all the same agenda. Only one agenda. Only one agenda. And now to get back, to finish off basically by going back to what I talked about at the beginning, the letter written to George Orwell from Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, and think about it over and over again. I always do, always have done. Agreeing with all that the critics have written of it, I need not tell you once more how fine and how profoundly important the book is. May I speak instead of the thing with which the book deals, again, this awfully important term, the ultimate revolution. The first hints of a philosophy of the ultimate revolution, the revolution which lies beyond politics and economics, and which aims at total subversion of the individual's psychology and physiology, are to be found in the Marquis de Sade, who regarded himself as the continuator, the consummator of Robespierre and Babeuf. He was a massive sexual pervert. What you see today? Well, there's no perversion anymore, is there? They've thrown the term out the window, of all kinds. The philosophy of the ruling minority in 1984 is a sadism, which has been carried to its logical conclusion. Remember, you can make them happy, obedient servants by using sadistic tricks on them, and they don't realize that by going along with it, all they're basically their virtue signaling, and I call it virtue social grandstanding and preening in front of the public. They're actually mocking you all if you don't go along with it. And there's always fear behind it if you do say something contrary to it as well. By going beyond sex and denying it, where in actual fact the policy of the boot on the face, that's what you're partly under that, and a big way under Huxley's way now of the indoctrination process, partly by the boot in the face can go on and definitely seems doubtful. My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing, and of satisfying its lust for power. And these ways will resemble those which I describe in Brave New World. And then he goes into, again, how he looked into animal magnetism, hypnotism, and struck by the way in which for 150 years the world has refused to take serious cognizance of the discoveries of Mesmer, Braid, Esdale, and the rest. Now today, I've gone into many times in different shows, but today I've mentioned the techniques that Bertrand Russell talked about with his 2 books on science, basically, and how they can control everyone through specialized indoctrinations, so that the subject will never be aware they're being indoctrinated, in fact. So go into cuttingthroughmatrix.com website, remember, folks, and you can get incredible wealth of information that I've done over many, many years from guys who helped set up this present system, including indoctrination processes when they started and when they were well underway, and bringing you up to date today. And remember, too, when you get in there, it'd be a good thing if you'd certainly help me out by buying the books and discs or donating a few bucks at a time, because so many people are using the website all the time and all this archive of information, which is free. And they tell me a lot, actually, about people too. Because what is their value of getting all the information, which they use in their own books and in their own shows in North America and so on, and outside? But what do they think of the society they want to actually, they may think they're actually fighting, or they're against it in some way or another, when they won't even contribute something to someone who has suffered a great deal over many years to get all this out. And you see, if you don't think about things or people, you are pretty well doomed, aren't you? The problem with the world is this world is so materialistic today. And we can be happy in our own delusions. We can delude ourselves into thinking everyone's doing okay, when they're not doing okay. That's called willful ignorance. That's really, you know certain things there, but you decide to be willful. I don't really want to know. How many times have you heard that about major events or topics that are coming up? They don't want to know. I don't want to know. Oh, that would set me. I don't want to know. That's willfully ignorant. Here you are with all of the facts that are going to affect all their lives in the minutest to the most drastic ways, and they don't want to know. That might burst their happy bubble. The bubble that's been created by the system that indoctrinated them, and they live inside of it with their little hobbies or whatever else they do, and they don't care about what happens to other people. So you got to think about it. You got to really think about it. And for all the people I've used that lived long before me, they helped put things together, and I had to spend years and years and years, a whole life actually, studying it. And I started very early studying what really was happening. It's like, I want to know why the world was wrong as I saw it. How could Britain, this Great Britain they called it, that ran a good part of the world, how come most folk that I knew were utterly broke and working class and lived at a real austerity level, which you can't imagine today, but you're going to be taught it gradually over the next few years? What happened to all that money? Who did profit from it? Who benefited from it? Who gave their lives for it and all the rest of it? You see, so I did an awful lot of studying. I came out with the Bertrand Russell books and all that on the air years and years ago, and it's been copied by other hosts that even adapted my bio into theirs. It's quite amazing, isn't it? So you can influence so many people, but you don't get a penny from them. There are some out there who do occasionally donate to me, and that's awfully nice of them. I was going to mention too, there's one guy who just gave me one recently, a little donation, and it's just to mention his name, I think it was Ray Mann. But most folk quietly just give me a couple of bucks here and there, and that's about it. I've got all these websites to run. I've got my own costs, of course, in all other ways as well. But it's astonishing to look at all the folk that are downloading, and the vast majority of them, and a lot of them ask me questions all the time, that they email me questions galore, as though I've nothing else to do except answer them, and they don't ever send you a single penny. And you've never heard of them before, you know. That's quite something else. So willful ignorance, I guess he's doing okay. Well, that's because you want to believe so, because you don't want to know that maybe you should pass a few bucks this way, or buy the books or discs, etc. at cuttingthroughmatrix.com. Help out those, help out with you. You understand what kind of world you're heading towards if you won't help each other out? You'll be taken for a ride yourselves by the big boys at the top completely, who also have no care about how you're getting along, or even if you are getting along. We have to get more humanity back into our lives. I know it's with multiculturalism, it's destroying that. Because the cultures end up settling in their own areas, en masse, and they all live quite happily inside their own communities. But in the process, they destroy the domestic populations and the old cultures. That's intentionally been used today with mass immigration from the sites that the countries have bombed out of existence pretty well, with these ongoing wars across the entire Middle East, which is all planned, of course. And I've gone through the histories of that until I'm sick of talking about them as well. Well documented, there's no arguing about it. But everything's used, including the immigration, to destroy something else and bring in something new. But in the process, it destroys our humanity of indigenous civilizations and populations to each other. You can't survive when you destroy that. Because what happens when you're in trouble? Who's going to help you? But anyway, I hope I've given you something with these last two talks on. I just picked Pierre Trudeau's son because that's how I got it in. They packaged him as the new star on the block and sold it to the populace because we are the consumers, and they package up things for us to consume, including people. It could be any party today, wouldn't matter, because we'll have one agenda, and these ongoing treaties are signed by every group and every party that gets into power. It's ongoing agendas as they always sign it and sign it and sign it until they get where. And if you think about it too, how come you always sign the same continuation of the same documentation? How come no one comes in and tears up and says, no, this is bad for the country? Well, it tells you don't have countries anymore. Countries today are only mentioned when they're using your troops and your finances and tax money to go off and fight another war that'll end up having repercussions on you back home, and it's not for your benefit at all. From Hamish myself from Ontario, Canada, it's good night to me, your God or your gods go with you.